Welcome to True Crime Cases. The sun had barely begun to rise over the quiet town of Maple Hills when a phone call shattered the tranquil silence of the Dawson household in an ordinary family home nestled in a tree-lined street. A mother picked up the receiver, never knowing that this single moment would irrevocably change the course of their lives, as the monotone voice on the other end of the line informed them of a horrific series of murders. Neither Karen nor David Dawson could believe what they were hearing. The unimaginable had come to pass. Their daughter, Amy Dawson, was at the center of a violent spree of killings that had left the community in a state of shock and disbelief. But this is not where our story begins. It begins many years earlier in that same quiet home with the picture-perfect image of a seemingly normal girl growing up in an idyllic suburban town, as the Dawson family faces the grim reality that their child has become a cold-blooded killer. The investigation uncovers chilling details, slowly piecing together the life and psyche of Amy Dawson. This documentary aims to explore the haunting question: how does an innocent child grow into a mass murderer, and how could her parents have missed the signs? Amy Dawson was born on a warm summer evening in June 1994. The first and only child of Karen and David. Maple Hills was the kind of town where everyone knew each other. A close-knit community with little crime and a strong sense of belonging. David, a high school science teacher, and Karen, a nurse at the local hospital, were overjoyed when they brought their baby girl home for the first time. Amy's childhood seemed unremarkable, a typical story of a girl growing up in a loving and stable environment. She was quiet but never withdrawn, a straight A student and a regular at the local youth group. As the years passed, Karen and David marveled at how obedient and well-behaved Amy was compared to other children her age. She never threw tantrums, never argued, and followed rules to the letter. She was always so compliant. Karen recalls her voice shaking slightly. She never gave us any trouble. I thought it was just because she was naturally well-behaved. We thought we were lucky to have such a good child. But underneath Amy's placid exterior, something far more disturbing was brewing, something that neither her parents nor anyone in Maple Hills could have predicted. As Amy moved into her teenage years, small cracks in her demeanor began to show. Though Karen and David still saw her as the perfect child, there were subtle signs that something wasn't right. Teachers at her high school began reporting troubling behavior disruptions in class, dark and violent artwork, and an increasing tendency to isolate herself from others. At first, I thought it was just a phase, says Miss Thornton, Amy's art teacher. Teenagers go through mood swings. But there was something about Amy's art that unsettled me. It wasn't just teenage angst. There was a coldness in the way she depicted violence. It wasn't expressive. It was clinical. Amy's friends, too, began to distance themselves in interviews with her former classmates. Several described an increasing unease in being around her by junior year. She just changed, recalls one of her former friends, Emma. It was like she stopped caring about anyone or anything. She had this habit of staring, just staring at you, like she was watching and waiting for something to happen. Despite these red flags, Amy's parents dismissed the concerns. Karen, a nurse, attributed her daughter's odd behavior to stress from school. David, the optimist, believed Amy was simply going through a phase. They convinced themselves that their daughter's strange demeanor was nothing more than the growing pains of adolescence. Yet, as investigators would later discover, this was the first indication of the darkness that had been festering within Amy for years. The perfect, obedient child had been hiding something all along. It was the summer after Amy's high school graduation, when the first murder occurred. The body of a local drifter, Michael Grant, was found in the woods just outside of town. His throat slashed in what appeared to be a random act of violence. Maple Hills, a town unaccustomed to such brutal crimes, was shaken. The police had no leads, and the crime was dismissed as the work of an outsider passing through. But it wasn't long before more bodies started turning up. The killings were sporadic, and the victims seemed unrelated. An elderly woman in her home, a teenage boy found strangled by the riverbank, a young mother stabbed to death in a grocery store parking lot. Each murder was more violent than the last, and the town was gripped by fear. Locking doors at night, something they had never done before, became a regular ritual for the town's people. At the time, no one suspected Amy. She had just started college and was living at home with her parents, commuting to a nearby university to those around her. She seemed like a normal young woman, quiet, focused on her studies, and still the well-mannered girl they had always known. But investigators later revealed that Amy had been living a double life. The quiet, obedient daughter at home was in fact a cold, calculating killer, and with each murder she grew bolder, more confident in her ability to evade capture. The truth about Amy Dawson came to light on an otherwise ordinary day. In November, Karen and David had noticed a change in their daughter's behavior. In the weeks leading up to that day, she had become more withdrawn, her eyes hollow and distant. But when they discovered her notebook, everything they thought they knew about their daughter came crashing down. David found it tucked beneath her mattress while cleaning her room, a small black leather journal filled with detailed descriptions of the murders Amy had chronicled, each crime describing in meticulous detail how she had stalked her victims, how she had killed them, and how she had felt nothing but exhilaration. Afterward, we thought it was a joke at first. David says his voice choked with disbelief. I didn't want to believe it, but the way she wrote the details, it was her, our Amy. In the days that followed, Karen and David faced a harrowing decision: turn their daughter in or protect her. It was an impossible choice. But as more bodies began to surface and the community's fear mounted, the Dawson realized they could no longer live in denial. The night they called the police was the hardest night of their lives. Karen sobbed uncontrollably as David made the call, his hands trembling as he gave their address when the police arrived to arrest Amy. She didn't resist. She didn't cry, didn't plead. She simply stared at her parents with those cold, dead eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at them with love and innocence during her interrogation. Amy showed no remorse for the murders. She spoke calmly, matter-of-factly, as though she were discussing the weather, rather than the lives she had taken. Investigators were struck by her complete lack of empathy. She felt no guilt, no shame, only a detached sense of curiosity about how far she could push herself. She was unlike anyone I've ever interrogated, says Detective Harris. The lead investigator on the case. Most people show some kind of emotion, whether it's fear, anger, regret, but Amy, she was empty. It was chilling. In her confession, Amy revealed that she had started fantasizing about killing. From a young age, she described the sensation of power she felt when she took someone's life, how it made her feel invincible. The murders, she said, had been a way for her to assert control over a world she felt increasingly disconnected from. The case was airtight. Amy's journal, her confession, and forensic evidence all pointed to her guilt. But as the trial approached, the question that haunted everyone, her parents, the investigators, and the community, was why? Why had Amy, a girl who had grown up in a loving home, turned into a monster? The trial of Amy Dawson was one of the most sensational in the town's history. Reporters from across the country descended on Maple Hills, eager to cover the story of the small-town girl turned mass murderer. The courtroom was packed every day with locals, reporters, and even strangers who had come just to catch a glimpse of Amy. Karen and David sat in the front row, their faces pale and drawn. They had been advised by their attorney not to speak to the press, but their silence only fueled the media's speculation. How could two loving parents raise a child who turned into a killer? What had gone wrong? Amy's defense team tried to argue that she had suffered from undiagnosed mental illness, pointing to her violent fantasies and lack of empathy as evidence of a deeper psychological disorder. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about the possibility of antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy. But the prosecution, armed with Amy's own chilling confessions and journal entries, painted a picture of a cold, calculating killer who knew exactly what she was doing. In the end, the jury took less than 2 hours to deliver their verdict: guilty on all counts. Amy Dawson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, Amy remained expressionless, as though the outcome didn't matter to her in the slightest. The trial may have ended, but for Karen and David Dawson, the nightmare was far from over. Their daughter, the child they had loved and raised, was a mass murderer. The weight of that reality was unbearable. They had to leave Maple Hills, unable to face the stares and whispers of their former friends and neighbors. They moved to a small town miles away where no one knew their story. In the years that followed, Karen and David struggled to come to terms with what had happened. They visited Amy in prison once, but the experience was too painful. Amy was cold, distant, as though she barely recognized them. "I don't know that girl," Karen says quietly. "The girl we raised is gone. I don't know who that woman is." The story of Amy Dawson is one that continues to haunt the town of Maple Hills. It's a story of deception of a seemingly perfect child hiding a dark and violent secret. But it's also a story of the devastating consequences of denial, how Karen and David, in their desire to believe the best of their daughter, missed the signs that something was deeply wrong. As experts have since pointed out, Amy's behavior exhibited many of the hallmarks of a sociopath: a lack of empathy, a desire for control, and an ability to manipulate those around her. But what remains unclear is how much of this was nature and how much was nurture. Could anything have been done to prevent the tragedy? Or was Amy always destined to follow this dark path? Amy Dawes' trial may have ended with a guilty verdict, but the ramifications of her actions continued to ripple throughout Maple Hills and beyond. The psychological impact of her crimes and the revelations that followed left a profound mark on everyone connected to the case. This chapter of Amy's life was more than a study in law enforcement. It became an unsettling dive into the darkest corners of human nature. Karen and David's emotional collapse mirrored the unraveling of their daughter's true identity in their search for answers. They sought the guidance of psychologists who examined Amy's behavior from childhood to adulthood. Each meeting left the parents more devastated as experts dissected Amy's seemingly picture-perfect childhood. One psychologist, Dr. Stanley Hires, explained Amy's lack of emotion as an indicator of psychopathy, a condition that had likely been brewing under the surface for years. She likely experienced emotions differently from most people. Even as a child, Doctor explained in an interview, the fact that she was so obedient and compliant as a young girl may not have been a sign of a healthy child. It could have been a sign of emotional detachment. There was no rebellion because there was no real connection to the world around her. Karen would later recall that these meetings, while enlightening, felt like repeated stabs to her already broken heart. How could the girl she had cradled in her arms, sung to sleep at night, and loved so dearly to turn into someone capable of such atrocities? The portrait painted by the experts was not of a child who was led astray, but one who may have been wired for destruction from the start. David, always the pragmatist, found some solace in understanding the science behind Amy's behavior, but it didn't erase the gnawing guilt had they in some way contributed to her. Darkness, was there something they could have done differently? Every answer the experts provided seemed to open up 1,000 more questions, none of which gave them the closure they so desperately needed. Amy's life behind bars was equally unsettling. She remained cold and composed her demeanor unchanging. Even as the years passed, prison guards and inmates described her as unnervingly calm, showing no signs of remorse or fear. Amy's complete lack of reaction to her situation perplexed the staff, some of whom had dealt with violent offenders for decades and had never encountered someone so disconnected from their crimes. "She doesn't seem to care that she's here," said one correctional officer who worked with Amy daily. "Most people get angry or at least upset when they realize they're stuck here for life, but her nothing. It's like she's already accepted it, or worse, like she never cared to begin with." Amy quickly developed a reputation within the prison for her intelligence and manipulative behavior. She rarely engaged in physical altercations, but had a way of psychologically dominating those around her. She was never overtly cruel, but subtly managed to sow discord among the inmates, playing them against each other with carefully chosen words. It wasn't long before Amy became something of a shadowy figure within the prison, feared not for her strength, but for her cunning. In interviews with prison psychologists, Amy continued to show an eerie detachment. When asked if she felt any regret for the murders, her answer was chillingly simple. No. They were necessary back in Maple Hills. The shock of Amy's crimes lingered long after the trial. The once quiet town, known for its friendly neighbors and close-knit community, became infamous as the home of a mass murderer. The sense of betrayal was palpable. Many of Amy's former friends, teachers, and neighbors struggled to reconcile the sweet, quiet girl they had known with the violent killer she had become. You think You know, someone said Miss Thornton Amy's high school art teacher. I looked at her artwork for years, and yes, there was darkness in it, but I never imagined it was real. I never thought for a second that she was capable of what she did. Local parents became more protective of their own children, some going so far as to seek psychological evaluations for their kids, terrified that they too might be harboring hidden darkness. The fear that someone could live among them for years without revealing their true nature haunted the town. Karen and David were forced to sell their home and relocate the whispers in town. The sideways glances and the weight of knowing that their daughter was responsible for so much pain became too much to bear. Moving away didn't erase the memories, but it gave them a chance to start over, even if starting over meant carrying an invisible burden that no one could fully understand. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of all was the death of John Dawson, Amy's cousin, and one of her earliest victims. John had survived the initial attack, but succumbed to his injuries in the hospital weeks later. Later, his death, though not as violent as some of Amy's other crimes, left an indelible scar on the Dawson family. For David and Karen, John's death was an unforgivable loss, one that further fractured their already shattered family. His parents, David's brother and sister-in-law, could hardly look at them after the trial, knowing that their niece had taken the life of their son. Family gatherings, once filled with laughter and warmth, were now marked by absence and silence. I think that was the worst part of it all. David later reflected losing John. I mean, yes, all those lives were lost, and I don't diminish any of them. But John, he was family, he was our blood, and Amy took him from us. Amy Dawson's case became a subject of national debate. Many questioned whether justice had truly been served. Amy's lack of remorse and her calculated approach to the killings led some to argue that life imprisonment wasn't enough. Shouldn't someone so cold, so unrepentant, face the death penalty? Others argued that Amy's mental state should have been a bigger factor in her sentencing. Was she truly in control of her actions, or was she a product of a deeply disturbed mind? Legal scholars dissected the case, pointing to Amy as an example of the complexities of criminal justice. The question of punishment versus rehabilitation loomed large. Was it possible to rehabilitate someone like Amy, or was she beyond saving? Could her lack of emotion be treated, or was she simply born different in the end? Amy remained behind bars, her sentence unchanged, but the debate about her fate continued to simmer long after the trial, becoming a case study in legal and psychological circles. Her crimes and the lack of clear answers left a lasting imprint on both the community and the country at large. Karen and David's lives would never return to what they once were. The guilt of having raised a killer weighed heavily on them, despite the psychologist's assurances that Amy's behavior was likely the result of factors beyond their control. They found solace in small things, a new home, new routines, and in each other, but the void left by Amy's crimes, by John's death, and by the loss of their family's innocence would never truly be filled. We visit her sometimes, Karen admitted in one of her final interviews, but it's hard. She's not the same person. Or maybe she is, and we just never really knew her. I don't know which is worse. David, for his part, remained stoic, though his eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen too much pain. "You do what you can to move on," he said. But there's no moving on from this. Not really. The story of Amy Dawson serves as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can hide beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lives. It's a story that raises more questions than answers. A story of nature versus nurture, of guilt and innocence, of love and betrayal. For Karen and David Dawson, and for the town of Maple Hills, it is a story they will carry with them for the rest of their lives. In the end, it isn't just about a girl who became a killer. It's about the fragility of trust, the unpredictability of human nature, and the terrible consequences of looking the other way. The Dawsons' lives, once filled with love and laughter, are now marked by silence and loss. A family torn apart by the darkness that had been festering within their own home all along. For the people of Maple Hills, the scars of Amy's crimes will never fully heal. They will always wonder if there was something they could have done, some sign they could have seen. But the truth is, some monsters can't be stopped. Some are born, not made, and their true nature is revealed only when the damage is already done. This has been another episode of Shadowed Secrets, where we explore the darkest corners of the human mind and the crimes that shock the world. Remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all our latest episodes. Until next time, stay safe and keep your loved ones close.